A couple of years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to take a weekend trip to New York City. We hadn't been able to travel much due to our work schedules, so when we found this amazing Airbnb listing in Manhattan, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for a short getaway. The place was a beautiful modern loft in Soho, located in a trendy neighborhood with great access to restaurants, shops, and all the things we wanted to explore. We had stayed in Airbnbs before, but nothing this luxurious. It was one of those sleek minimalist apartments you'd see in a design magazine. Exposed brick, huge windows, modern art, and super clean. The photos on the listing matched up exactly with what we saw when we arrived, which was a huge relief. We were welcomed by a smart lock system, so we never even met the host in person. That seemed pretty common in a city like New York, so we didn't think much of it. The first day was perfect. We went out, did some shopping, had dinner at a cute little Italian spot nearby, and spent the evening relaxing in the loft. The vibe was exactly what we were hoping for. The loft had a huge TV and a great sound system, so we ended the night with a movie and some wine. We went to bed, feeling like we had finally found some peace from our busy lives. The next morning, we did a little more exploring in the city, grabbed brunch, and even managed to sneak in a trip to the Met. We had made a full day of it, and by the time we got back to the loft in the evening, we were exhausted. We decided to stay in that night, maybe order some food and relax. While my boyfriend was in the shower, I started getting ready for bed, going through my usual routine of taking off makeup and putting on pajamas. I'm not a super paranoid person, but at some point, as I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, something caught my eye. There was a smoke detector in the corner of the bedroom ceiling. That in itself wasn't weird. The place had all the standard safety features you'd expect in a rental. But this smoke detector looked a little different. It wasn't centered like most smoke detectors are, and the light on it didn't blink like I was used to seeing. I didn't mention anything to my boyfriend when he got out of the shower because I thought maybe I was just being paranoid or over-analyzing things. But that feeling didn't go away. Later that night, as we were getting ready to go to bed, I looked up at the smoke detector again and I couldn't help but feel like something was off. I got up on the bed and took a closer look. The casing around it seemed too shiny, almost like it had been tampered with recently. That's when I noticed a small, dark lens behind the plastic. I felt my heart drop. I stepped down from the bed trying to act normal, and my mind started racing. I didn't want to freak out, but I also didn't know what to do. I casually asked my boyfriend if he had noticed anything strange about the smoke detector, and he shrugged it off, saying it looked fine to him, but I wasn't convinced. Later, when my boyfriend fell asleep, I couldn't help but keep glancing at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. It wasn't just the bedroom. I realized that if there was a camera in there, there could be more. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and started scanning the loft for other suspicious devices. In the living room, I noticed another one. This time, it was a small clock on the shelf that had a similar lens hidden behind the glass. By then, I was full-on panicking. I woke my boyfriend up and told him everything. He thought I was overreacting at first, but once I showed him the clock and the smoke detector, his face went pale. We decided to check the rest of the place, and sure enough, we found 2 more hidden cameras. One in the kitchen, tucked behind a decorative plant, and another in the bathroom. I can't even describe the feeling that hit me. The realization that we had been recorded during our most private moments was horrifying. I immediately felt exposed, violated, and unsafe in a place that just hours before had felt like a luxurious escape. My boyfriend wanted to confront the host right away, but I wasn't sure if that was the right move. What if this person was dangerous? Instead, we quickly packed our bags and left the apartment even though it was late at night. We didn't have a plan. We just wanted to get out. We ended up walking around the city with our suitcases for a while, unsure of where to go. Eventually, we found a last-minute hotel room. We couldn't sleep, though. My mind kept racing with thoughts of what had been recorded, where that footage might end up, and how long we had been watched without knowing. The next morning, we contacted Airbnb and reported the situation, but things got messy fast. The host denied everything, of course. He claimed that we were fabricating the entire story, and even suggested that we had damaged his property. Airbnb opened an investigation, but it was a slow and frustrating process. We also went to the police, hoping they would be able to help, but they weren't much use. We were told that hidden cameras in rental properties weren't entirely uncommon, but unless we had solid proof of illegal recordings being made, there wasn't much they could do. Without access to the footage or any direct evidence that the cameras were actively recording us, it was our word against the hosts. In the meantime, I became obsessed with trying to find out if our footage had been posted anywhere. I searched every dark corner of the internet, combing through voyeuristic websites and forums, but I couldn't find anything concrete. That didn't stop me from imagining the worst. That intimate moments of our trip had been uploaded for strangers to watch, shared without our consent. The rest of the trip was a blur. We couldn't enjoy New York anymore. I felt like I couldn't trust anyone or anything. Even back home, I became paranoid about hidden cameras everywhere, in hotel rooms, dressing rooms, public bathrooms. It wasn't something I had ever really thought about before, but now it was always in the back of my mind. Eventually, Airbnb sent us a partial refund, but they never fully admitted any wrongdoing on the host's part. I never got a straight answer about whether the cameras were recording, where the footage might be, or if this had happened to other guests before us. We tried following up with the police, but again, without solid evidence, nothing ever came of it. I still think about that loft sometimes. I think about the cameras and the way they were placed in such ordinary spots, blending into the decor in a way that made them almost invisible. It's terrifying how easy it was for someone to violate our privacy like that without us even noticing. I'm much more cautious now whenever I stay in any rental property. I always check for hidden cameras, inspect smoke detectors, and never assume that just because a place looks clean and modern, it's safe. It's hard to feel completely comfortable when you know that there are people out there who will go to great lengths to invade your privacy for their own twisted purposes. Looking back, I'm grateful that we got out of there when we did, but the whole experience has left a lasting mark on me. It's a reminder that even in places that seem perfect on the surface, there can be hidden dangers lurking just out of sight. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. I just don't think I can do it again, knowing what I know now. Maybe one day I'll feel differently, but for now I stick to hotels, even though I know that they're not immune to these kinds of things either. It's just a little easier to trust when there's a front desk, a clear security policy, and less of a chance of a random person having access to your space. I wish I could say that the whole situation is behind me, but I don't think I'll ever really stop thinking about it. Privacy is something we take for granted until it's ripped away from us, and once it's gone, it's hard to feel completely secure again. So yeah, if you ever book an Airbnb or any kind of rental, do yourself a favor and check everything. What looks like an ordinary smoke detector or a harmless clock might be something far more sinister. I learned that the hard way, and I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone. This happened a couple of years ago when I decided to take a solo trip up to the Adirondacks in New York for a little writing retreat. I'm a freelance writer, and I thought it would be nice to get out of the city for a week, unplug, and just focus on my work. I'd been feeling pretty burnt out from deadlines and life in general, and this cabin I found on Airbnb looked perfect. Isolated, surrounded by woods with no distractions, just me, my laptop, and nature. The drive up was beautiful. I'd rented a small SUV to handle the mountain roads, and as I got closer to the cabin, the scenery was just breathtaking. Tall trees lined the narrow, winding road, and the air felt crisp and fresh. I couldn't believe how peaceful it was compared to the constant noise of the city. After about 6 hours on the road, I finally arrived. The cabin was just like the pictures. Rustic but modern enough to be comfortable, with a big stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the forest. The host had left me a message with instructions on how to get in. The place used one of those keypad locks, so I didn't have to meet anyone to get the key. Everything seemed easy enough, and after a quick look around, I felt like I'd found the perfect spot to relax and get some serious writing done. The first night was great. I made myself some dinner, lit a fire, and curled up with a book. I'm not usually much of a cook, but I had brought some groceries with me and figured I'd try to make the most of the kitchen. It was just me and the sound of the wind in the trees. I even started working on a few story ideas I'd been putting off. The isolation was exactly what I needed. No distractions, no noise, just the kind of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The second day, I decided to explore a bit. The cabin was surrounded by hiking trails, and since the weather was perfect, cool but not cold, I thought it'd be nice to go for a long walk and take in the scenery. I spent most of the afternoon hiking, lost in my thoughts, and snapping a few photos along the way. I didn't see another soul the entire time I was out, which only added to the feeling of complete solitude. It was exactly what I had been looking for when I booked this trip. When I got back to the cabin, I was exhausted from the hike and ready to relax. I tried to get in using the keypad, but the door wouldn't budge. At first I thought I must have entered the wrong code, so I tried again. Nothing. I double-checked the instructions the host had sent me, thinking maybe I'd misread something, but I hadn't. The lock just wasn't responding. I started to get a little frustrated. It was getting late, and the temperature was dropping fast. I tried the door a few more times, thinking maybe it was just a glitch or something. Still no luck. That's when I noticed that I didn't have any cell service. The host had mentioned that the signal could be spotty in the area, but I hadn't expected it to be completely dead. I walked around a bit, holding my phone up, hoping for at least one bar so I could text or call someone, but it was no use. At this point, I started to feel a little uneasy. I was in the middle of nowhere, locked out of a cabin with no way to contact anyone. It was getting dark, and the temperature was dropping quickly. I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't know anyone in the area, and the nearest town was at least an hour away by car. I walked around the cabin, checking all the windows and doors, hoping one of them might be unlocked, but they were all sealed up tight. I tried the back door, but it was locked too. I even considered breaking a window just to get inside, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure how the host would react to that, and I didn't want to cause damage unless I had no other option. As the sun set, I could feel the cold creeping in. I grabbed my jacket from my car and sat on the porch trying to figure out what to do. I had a flashlight in the car, so at least I wasn't completely in the dark. But that didn't make me feel any better about the situation. I was stuck, alone, in the middle of the woods. I kept thinking the host would message me back. I'd sent him a quick note earlier in the day just to let him know I had arrived safely, and everything was fine. I figured he'd see my message eventually and realize something was wrong when I didn't respond. But there was no way of knowing when that would be. By now it was fully dark, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath. I was cold, but I tried to stay calm. I kept thinking it would all be fine. The lock would magically work again, or someone would come by and help. I'd only been there for a day, but the area seemed safe enough. There was no reason to panic. Hours went by. I tried the door again, hoping that maybe the lock had reset or something, but it still wouldn't open. I was starting to get desperate. I had no idea what time it was anymore, and the only sounds I could hear were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps coming from behind the cabin, but when I shone the flashlight around, I didn't see anything. That's when I realized how truly alone I was. No cell service. No nearby neighbors. No way to contact anyone. Just me and the darkness. I spent most of that night sitting on the porch, huddled in my jacket and blanket, trying to stay warm. My mind was racing, going over every possible scenario. What if I couldn't get back in? What if something happened to me and no one knew? The hours dragged on, and I barely slept. Every little noise put me on edge, and the isolation, which had seemed so peaceful at first, now felt like a prison. At some point during the night, I heard something inside the cabin. It was faint, but it was definitely there. I stood up, listening closely, and I swear I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking around inside the cabin. My heart was racing, and I stood frozen on the porch, flashlight in hand, not knowing what to do. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But the sound didn't stop. It moved through the cabin from room to room, soft but unmistakable. I was outside, locked out, but there was no denying that someone or something was inside. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the porch, too scared to do anything else. My body was cold and stiff, and I couldn't stop shaking, but I didn't dare move. I kept thinking about the footsteps inside the cabin, about the fact that I was completely alone out here, and how no one would be able to help me if something went wrong. When the first light of morning finally crept through the trees, I felt a tiny bit of relief. At least it wasn't dark anymore. But I was still locked out, still with no way to get inside or contact anyone. I tried the door again. No luck. I walked around the cabin again, checking all the windows and doors, but everything was still locked. I decided to wait in the car for a bit, hoping the host would check his messages. The car was warmer than the porch at least, and I had enough gas to run the heater for a while. I kept glancing back at the cabin, half expecting to see someone standing in the window, but nothing happened. Finally, sometime late that morning, the door just opened. I was sitting in the car, debating whether to drive to the nearest town or not, when I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anyone, but it was open. I approached the door cautiously, not sure what to expect. When I stepped inside, everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs that anyone had been inside, and no explanation for why the door had suddenly unlocked. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but another part of me thought I was just being paranoid. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps, and maybe the lock had just malfunctioned. I was exhausted and freezing, and the cabin was warm, so I stayed. The rest of the day was a blur. I barely got any work done. I kept expecting something else to happen, for the door to lock me out again or for the footsteps to return. But nothing did. I didn't hear any more noises, and everything seemed normal. That night, I went to bed, but I didn't sleep much. I kept one ear open, waiting for any sounds from inside the cabin, but there were none. I couldn't relax, though. I kept thinking about how vulnerable I had been the night before, sitting out there in the cold, unable to get back in. And I kept thinking about those footsteps, how real they had sounded, and how there had been no sign of anyone in the cabin the next morning. By the time the trip was over, I was more than ready to leave. I didn't even bother telling the host about the lock. I just packed up, got in my car, and drove back to the city as fast as I could. I never looked back. I still think about that trip sometimes. I've tried to come up with logical explanations for everything that happened, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe the lock really did malfunction. Maybe I was just tired and imagining things. But I can't explain the footsteps. I know what I heard. It all started when my group of friends, there were 5 of us, decided to plan a reunion trip. We all went to college together, but since we graduated, life had gotten busy, and we hadn't had the chance to catch up in person. Someone suggested a weekend trip to the Catskills in New York. We all liked the idea of getting out of the city and spending some time in nature. A couple of us lived in Brooklyn, a couple in Manhattan, and one friend was up in Albany, so it was a central spot. We wanted to rent a big house so we could all stay together. And after a bit of searching, we found what looked like the perfect place on Airbnb. It was advertised as a rustic mountain house, but the photos made it look pretty charming. Kind of old but cozy. It had 5 bedrooms, a big kitchen, and a deck with views of the forest. The price was cheap, but we figured that was just because it wasn't peak season yet. The drive up was pretty smooth. I carpooled with 2 of my friends, and we met the others at the house. It was located off a small, winding road surrounded by thick trees. When we pulled up to the driveway, though, something seemed off right away. The house didn't look like the photos, at least not exactly. It was a lot more run down than we had expected. The paint was peeling, and the roof looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. There was a broken-down truck parked to the side of the house that definitely wasn't in the photos. We all exchanged a few awkward glances, but no one wanted to be the one to ruin the trip by complaining. We were here after all. We figured it wasn't a big deal, and that the inside would be better. We just wanted to have fun, so we grabbed our bags and headed inside. The moment we stepped through the front door, though, it was clear the photos had been staged to make the place look way better than it actually was. The furniture was old and dusty. The air smelled musty, and there were random piles of junk in the corners. Things like old newspapers, broken appliances, and what looked like a box of tangled Christmas lights. The kitchen was tiny and outdated, with a fridge that was making this weird humming noise that didn't sound normal at all. It felt like the house had been abandoned for a while, not a vacation rental someone was maintaining regularly. Still, we were trying to stay positive. The house wasn't great, but we could make it work for a couple of nights. We decided to unpack and make the best of it. After all, the plan was to hang out, cook some meals together, play some games, and maybe go hiking. A couple of hours in, though, we started noticing more things that seemed off. The first weird thing happened when one of my friends, Sarah, went to open a window in her bedroom to let in some fresh air. The window wouldn't budge, and when she took a closer look, she realized it had been nailed shut. She came downstairs and told us, but we all kind of shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was an old house thing or just the owner trying to prevent bugs from coming in. Then, a little later, one of my other friends, Dan, found a door in the hallway that was locked. It wasn't on the listing, and we didn't have a key for it. We thought maybe it was just a storage closet or something, so we didn't dwell on it too much. But the fact that it was locked, combined with the overall state of the house, left us all feeling uneasy. Still, we pushed those feelings down and tried to have a good time. That night, we cooked dinner and played some card games in the living room. We were having fun, but I couldn't shake this weird vibe the house gave off. It felt like it was too quiet out there in the woods, like something was missing. There was no Wi-Fi, which we had expected, but even our cell reception was spotty, so we couldn't really distract ourselves with our phones. That was probably for the best, though, since we wanted to focus on catching up with each other. Things took a turn when out of nowhere we heard a car pull up outside. It was late, probably around 10 p.m. We hadn't seen anyone else on the road when we arrived, and this house was pretty remote. We figured it was just a neighbor or maybe someone who had taken a wrong turn. But when we peeked outside, we saw a group of men getting out of a truck. There were 4 of them, all looking a little rough, like they'd just come from working a long shift. They started walking toward the house. At first, we thought they might be lost, but as they got closer, they didn't look confused. They looked like they were exactly where they meant to be. One of the guys knocked on the door, and when we didn't immediately answer, they started banging harder. We weren't sure what to do, but we finally opened the door a crack to see what they wanted. They told us they were the real owners of the house, and that we had no right to be there. They said the property had been sold to them recently, and we needed to leave immediately. We tried explaining that we had rented the place through Airbnb, that we had every right to be there, but they weren't listening. They were getting more aggressive, saying that we had been scammed, and that the house belonged to them now. One of the guys, the tallest one, kept glancing around the room like he was sizing it up. I noticed him staring at our bags near the door, and that's when I realized they weren't just here to kick us out. They were after more than that. Things escalated fast. The tallest guy pushed the door open wider and demanded that we hand over our wallets, phones, and anything else valuable. Another guy stepped around him and yanked Sarah's purse off the table. We were all frozen for a second trying to process what was happening, but then Dan tried to grab his phone and call the police. Before he could dial, one of the men grabbed the phone and threw it against the wall. The screen shattered. That's when they started tearing through our stuff. They didn't even care that we were standing right there watching. They went through our bags, took our money, our credit cards, even our car keys. We kept trying to reason with them, but they weren't listening. One of the guys disappeared into the back of the house, and we heard him cutting the phone line. Now we were completely cut off. No phones, no car, no way to get help. We were all panicking at this point, but we didn't know what to do. We were stuck in this remote house with no way to leave, and these guys had complete control over the situation. They didn't seem like they were in any rush either. They were taking their time going through our things, occasionally giving us these smug looks, like they knew we couldn't do anything to stop them. At some point, one of the guys went outside to check on the cars, but we knew what that meant. Sure enough, we heard the sounds of tires being slashed. They were making sure we couldn't go anywhere. My stomach dropped when I realized we were completely trapped. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they finally left. They took everything: our wallets, phones, car keys, and anything else they thought was valuable. Before they walked out the door, the tallest guy turned to us and said something like, "Don't bother calling the cops. We'll know if you do." Then they got back in their truck and drove off, leaving us standing there completely helpless. We sat in shock for a while, trying to figure out what to do. We had no way to contact anyone, no way to leave, and no idea if those guys were coming back. We checked the house again, hoping maybe they had missed something, but they had taken everything that could connect us to the outside world. Eventually, we decided to hunker down in the house for the night and figure things out in the morning. We barricaded the front door with some furniture and stayed together in the living room. None of us slept much that night. Every little noise outside made us jump, and we kept expecting those guys to come back. The next morning, we tried to assess the situation. Our car tires were slashed, just like we'd thought. There was no way we were getting out of there on our own. We ended up walking down the long dirt road, hoping to find someone who could help. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally came across a local who let us use their phone to call the police. The cops came and took our statements. But there wasn't much they could do. The men were long gone, and without any way to identify them or track them down, it was just another unsolved case. They told us we had probably been lured into a scam, that the house might not have been a legitimate rental at all. Apparently, it happens more than you'd think, especially in rural areas like that. We never got our stuff back, and as far as I know, they never caught the guys who did it. The whole experience left me feeling violated and scared in a way I'd never felt before. It wasn't just the fact that we lost our things. It was the way those men completely took control of the situation, how powerless we were to stop them. Looking back, I can't believe how naive we were to trust that everything was fine just because we booked it through a popular rental site. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since, and I don't think I ever will again. The idea of being in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by strangers with no easy way to get help, it's just not worth it. We were lucky things didn't get worse that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped completely at someone else's mercy. My story started when I decided to book an Airbnb in a remote part of West Virginia, just outside a small town called Elkins. I had been working non-stop in Washington, D.C., and really needed a break from city life. The idea of getting away to a quiet country home for a weekend seemed perfect. I imagined myself reading on the porch, drinking coffee in the mornings, and just enjoying the peace and quiet of nature. The house I found online looked great in the listing. It was a little cottage on the edge of some woods, about a 15-minute drive from town. The place was advertised as secluded, with lots of privacy and access to nearby hiking trails. I wanted to be alone, away from people, and this seemed like the ideal spot. The host, a woman named Katie, had great reviews, all mentioning how peaceful and relaxing the place was. I was sold. When I arrived, the house looked exactly like the pictures. It was small but cozy, with a big porch and a couple of rocking chairs out front. The air smelled fresh, and there were no sounds except for birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I could feel the stress of city life already melting away. Katie wasn't there to meet me in person, but she left a note with some basic instructions and a key in a lockbox by the door. She also left a short message saying, "Welcome," and that was about it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd stayed in Airbnbs where I never met the host before, and this wasn't any different. The first day went exactly as planned. I made myself some tea, sat out on the porch with a book, and just relaxed. The house had a kind of old charm to it. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and big windows that let in a lot of natural light. It was really quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could just breathe and unwind. That night, I cooked myself a simple dinner and settled in with a glass of wine, feeling pretty content with my choice to come out here. The house had no TV and the Wi-Fi was spotty, but that was kind of the point. I wanted to disconnect. By the time I went to bed, I was feeling really good about the weekend. I had this sense that I had found the perfect escape. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling rested. I decided to go for a short hike on one of the trails nearby. The air was cool and crisp, and I felt like I was completely alone out there in the woods. It was quiet, with just the sound of my footsteps on the dirt path and birds in the trees. I spent about 2 hours walking, exploring the area before heading back to the house. When I returned, I noticed something strange. There was a small bundle of sticks on the porch, right by the front door. They were tied together with a piece of twine, like someone had left them there on purpose. It wasn't there when I left earlier in the morning, so it had to have been placed there while I was out hiking. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't like any kind of decoration or craft, and there was no note or anything with it. I thought about calling Katie, the host, but I didn't want to seem paranoid over something as random as a bundle of sticks. Maybe it was some weird local tradition, or maybe a neighbor had left it there for some reason. Either way, I decided to just ignore it. Later that day, as I was sitting out on the porch again, I noticed a man standing a little ways off, just at the edge of the trees. He was far enough away that I couldn't see his face clearly, but close enough that I could tell he was watching me. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there staring in my direction. I waved at him, kind of half expecting him to wave back or say something, but he didn't move. He just kept standing there, not reacting at all. After a few minutes, he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing from view. The whole thing made me feel uneasy. I wasn't sure if it was just a curious neighbor, but something about the way he had just stood there, not acknowledging me, felt off. I tried to brush it off, but it left me on edge for the rest of the day. That evening, I decided to head into town for dinner. I wanted to get out of the house for a bit and maybe clear my mind after that weird encounter. Elkins was small, with just a few restaurants and shops, but it had a friendly, welcoming vibe. I ended up at a little diner, eating a burger and watching the locals chat with each other like they all knew one another. I thought about asking if anyone had heard of any strange neighbors around the area, but I didn't want to seem like an outsider making trouble. When I got back to the house that night, I noticed something that made my heart race. The back door, which I had locked before I left, was slightly open. Just a crack, but enough for me to know that someone had been inside while I was gone. I stood frozen on the porch, staring at that door, trying to figure out what to do. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and leave, but I didn't have anywhere else to go that late at night, and the nearest hotel was a good drive away. I told myself maybe I hadn't closed it properly before leaving, and I was just imagining things. I took a deep breath, walked inside, and checked the house. Nothing seemed out of place. My bags were where I had left them. The kitchen was untouched, and everything was in the same spot as before. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. I even moved a chair in front of the back door, just in case. I spent the rest of the evening trying to calm down, but my mind kept going back to that man I had seen earlier. Who was he? Why had he just stood there watching me? And who had opened the door? I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise outside made me jump, and I kept imagining footsteps on the porch or someone trying to open the door again. But the night passed without anything else happening, and by morning I was trying to convince myself that I was just overreacting. Maybe the guy I saw was harmless and the door had just blown open. I kept telling myself these things, but I couldn't fully shake the feeling that something was wrong. That morning, I mentioned that I had texted Katie just to check in. I didn't bring up the bundle of sticks or the man who had been watching me. I simply said something along the lines of asking if everything was going well, and whether she had experienced any issues with the doors not staying locked. Katie responded quickly, stating that she hadn't heard of any problems and asking if I was okay. I reassured her that everything was fine and didn't say anything further. I spent the rest of the morning reading, trying to relax, but around noon, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. I glanced out the window and saw two men standing near the porch. They weren't the same guy I had seen the day before, but they were looking toward the house, talking to each other quietly. I froze, unsure of what to do. They hadn't knocked or made any attempt to talk to me. They were just standing there, like they were deciding what to do next. I moved to the side of the window, trying not to be seen, and watched them for a few more minutes. Eventually, they walked off into the woods, just like the man from the day before. By now, I was starting to panic. This wasn't normal. People didn't just hang around strangers' houses like that. I decided to call Katie, this time telling her everything. The bundle of sticks, the man watching me, the open door, and now the two men outside. I could hear the concern in her voice immediately. She asked me to describe the men, and when I did, she got quiet for a moment before telling me I should leave the house as soon as possible. I pressed her, asking why, but she wouldn't give me a straight answer. She just said I needed to pack my things and go. She apologized and said she would refund my stay, but I shouldn't stay another night. That's when I really started freaking out. If the host was telling me to leave, then something was seriously wrong. I grabbed my stuff, threw it into my car as quickly as I could, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those men following me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about 20 miles down the road, where I finally felt safe enough to take a breath and calm down. I never got a clear explanation from Katie about what had happened or who those men were. She refunded my stay and apologized again, but that was it. I didn't press her for details, honestly. I didn't want to know. Looking back, I'm still not sure what was going on at that house. Maybe those men were just locals, checking out who was staying in the area. But something about the whole situation felt wrong. I've stayed in a lot of Airbnbs since then, but I always make sure they're in more populated areas now. I'm not taking any more chances with secluded cabins or isolated country homes. That weekend taught me that not everything is as peaceful as it seems, and sometimes getting away from it all can lead to something far more dangerous than you ever expect. A couple of years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to take a weekend trip to the Poconos in Pennsylvania. We were both living in Philadelphia at the time and wanted to escape the city for a while. Life had been pretty hectic for both of us, and we thought a quiet getaway in the mountains would be the perfect way to unwind. Neither of us had spent much time in the Poconos, but it's well known for having great hiking spots, cozy cabins, and being a peaceful retreat. We found this cute little lakeside cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect for what we were looking for. Private, quiet, and surrounded by nature. The photos on the listing showed a rustic but clean cabin with a big porch, a fire pit outside, and a little dock on the lake. The reviews were mostly positive, mentioning how peaceful and relaxing it was. The only downside mentioned was that there was no cell service and very limited Wi-Fi, but that didn't bother us. We wanted to disconnect anyway. The drive up was beautiful. We left the city early in the morning and made good time, arriving around mid-afternoon. The area was exactly what we'd hoped for. Quiet, and tucked away from the main roads, with dense woods on all sides and a crystal-clear lake that looked like something out of a postcard. The cabin itself was a bit smaller than we'd expected, but it had that cozy, old-fashioned feel that made it seem charming. The host had left us a message with the key code for the door and a few notes about the place. One detail that stood out was a line advising us not to go into the basement, as there were ongoing renovations. It seemed a little weird, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't uncommon for rental properties to have off-limits areas. We were just there for a relaxing weekend, and the last thing we wanted to do was poke around a musty basement anyway. We spent the rest of the first day settling in, exploring the area around the lake, and planning out some hikes for the weekend. It was exactly the break from city life we had needed. No noise, no people, just us and nature. That night we cooked dinner in the small kitchen, had a few drinks by the fire pit outside, and ended the night curled up on the couch, watching a movie we'd downloaded beforehand. Things took a turn the next day. We woke up early and decided to go for a hike on one of the nearby trails. The weather was perfect, sunny but cool with just a light breeze. We spent a few hours hiking, taking photos, and just enjoying being out in the woods. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was mid-afternoon and we were both tired. I suggested we take a nap before figuring out dinner, so we headed inside. As soon as we walked in, though, we heard this loud bang coming from somewhere inside the house. It startled both of us because it was so sudden and loud, like something heavy had fallen or been knocked over. My boyfriend and I just stood there for a moment, trying to figure out where the noise had come from. We checked the living room and kitchen, but everything seemed normal. That's when we realized the sound had probably come from the basement. We both kind of hesitated, remembering the host's warning not to go down there. But curiosity got the best of us. My boyfriend, who's always more curious about these things than I am, said he was going to take a quick look just to make sure nothing had happened down there, like a pipe bursting or something. I didn't love the idea, but I wasn't about to sit there while he went down alone, so I followed him to the basement door. The door itself was at the far end of the hallway, near the back of the house. It was an old, heavy wooden door with a big metal lock on it, but the lock wasn't engaged. My boyfriend opened the door, and we were hit with this rush of cold air that smelled damp and musty, like a basement that hadn't been aired out in years. The stairs were steep and creaky, leading down into a dark, unfinished basement. My boyfriend grabbed his phone and used the flashlight to illuminate the way as we slowly made our way down. The basement was exactly what you'd expect. Old concrete floors, exposed beams, and shelves filled with random junk like old tools and paint cans. There was no sign of anything out of place, no broken pipes or anything that could explain the noise. We were about to head back upstairs when we heard another noise, a sharp creak from above us, like someone walking across the floor upstairs. We both froze for a second, listening. I whispered to my boyfriend, asking if he had locked the front door when we came back from the hike, but he wasn't sure. Panic started creeping in. What if someone had gotten inside while we were out? We quickly headed back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment we got to the top of the stairs, my boyfriend went to close the basement door, but before he could, it slammed shut with this loud, echoing bang. I jumped, and my boyfriend tried the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like someone had locked it from the other side. At that point, I was freaking out. I couldn't understand how the door had locked itself, and there was no lock on our side of the door. We tried pushing on it, pulling on it, but it didn't move. It was stuck, and we were trapped in the basement. My boyfriend kept trying to force the door open while I started to panic. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, just like we'd known there wouldn't be. We had no way to call for help, and no one knew we were out there. We were completely on our own. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as we tried everything to get the door open. My boyfriend tried kicking it, throwing his weight against it, but it was like the door was bolted shut from the other side. Every time he tried, it echoed through the basement, this heavy, dead sound that made me feel more and more trapped. We sat there for a while, trying to calm down and figure out what to do. The air in the basement was cold, and it felt like it was getting harder to breathe. The only light we had was from my boyfriend's phone, and the battery was draining fast. There was this crushing silence around us, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling above us. But every now and then, I swore I could hear something else. Faint footsteps, like someone was walking around upstairs. Neither of us said it, but we were both thinking the same thing. Someone was in the house. Maybe that someone had locked us down here. It didn't make sense, but what else could explain the door slamming shut and refusing to open? At some point, my boyfriend decided to look for another way out. He started searching the basement for any kind of window or exit, but there was nothing. The only small windows were up near the ceiling, too small to crawl through, and they were sealed shut. We were trapped. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, my back against the wall, trying to keep myself from completely losing it. After what felt like forever, we heard another noise, this time from the basement stairs. It was faint, just a small creak, like someone had stepped on one of the steps. My boyfriend flashed his phone toward the stairs, but there was nothing there, just the empty staircase leading up to the locked door. By now I was shaking, and my boyfriend wasn't doing much better. We were both on edge, waiting for something to happen, not knowing what or who was outside that door. The hours dragged on, and with no cell service, no power, and no way out, we were completely helpless. Eventually, my boyfriend started trying to use one of the tools from the basement to pry open the door. He found an old crowbar on one of the shelves and managed to wedge it between the door and the frame. Slowly, inch by inch, he forced the door open, and after what felt like an eternity, it finally gave way. We stumbled back upstairs, and the house was dead silent. Nothing was out of place, and there was no sign that anyone had been inside. We didn't waste any time grabbing our things and getting the hell out of there. We didn't care about the rest of the weekend or the money we'd spent on the cabin. We just wanted to leave. As we were loading up the car, I glanced back at the house one last time. The basement door, the one we had spent hours trying to open, was wide open now, just hanging there like nothing had ever been wrong with it. We drove back to Philadelphia that night, not saying much to each other. We were both too shaken up to process what had just happened. I never contacted the host again, and they never reached out to us either. We left a short review on Airbnb, something vague about the place being too isolated for our liking, but we didn't mention the basement or what had happened. To this day, I still don't know what was going on in that cabin. Maybe it was just some kind of mechanical failure with the door. Or maybe there was someone else there. All I know is that I've never felt as scared or as trapped as I did that day in the basement, and I'm not eager to find myself in a situation like that again. This happened in 2021 when I decided to take a solo trip to Charleston, South Carolina. I'd never really done much solo traveling before, but I had some time off from work and thought it would be a good way to unwind and get out of my comfort zone. I had heard Charleston was beautiful, with its historic architecture, good food, and southern charm, so it seemed like the perfect place to spend a week exploring and relaxing. I booked a little apartment on Airbnb that was in a historic part of the city. The listing said it was in an older building, but it had been recently renovated. The photos made it look cozy and clean, with hardwood floors, brick walls, and large windows that let in a lot of natural light. The reviews were positive, mostly talking about how close it was to the downtown area and how quiet and safe the neighborhood felt. The price was reasonable, so I went ahead and booked it. The host's name was Greg, and he messaged me a few times before my trip to confirm the details and give me some recommendations on places to visit and restaurants to try. He seemed friendly enough, maybe a bit overly enthusiastic, but I didn't think much of it. I'd stayed in Airbnbs before, and hosts were usually eager to help make the trip enjoyable. I appreciated the advice, and it put me at ease knowing I had a local contact in case anything came up. When I arrived in Charleston, everything seemed great at first. The city was beautiful, just like I had imagined. The streets were lined with big oak trees and colorful historic houses. When I got to the apartment, it was just as it had been in the pictures, if not better. It had this charming, old-fashioned vibe with exposed brick and high ceilings. There was a little courtyard outside, and it felt tucked away from the busy streets. Greg wasn't there to meet me in person, but he had left the key in a lockbox by the door, and everything seemed straightforward. The place was clean, and it smelled fresh, like it had been recently aired out. I unpacked my things and got settled in. It was late in the afternoon by the time I arrived, so I didn't do much that first evening other than grab a quick bite at a nearby cafe and stroll around the neighborhood. The next day, I woke up early and went out to explore the city. I spent most of the day walking around, visiting some of the historic sites and eating at a local seafood restaurant. I was really enjoying the trip so far. Being on my own was a little strange, but I liked the freedom of doing whatever I wanted without having to stick to anyone else's schedule. When I got back to the apartment that evening, I had a message from Greg. He asked how my day had gone and if everything was okay with the apartment. I responded politely, telling him that everything was fine and that I was enjoying my time in Charleston. He replied almost immediately, saying that he was glad I was having fun and offering a few more suggestions for things to do. It seemed normal enough, but I noticed that his messages were starting to come in more frequently. He messaged again later that night, asking if I needed anything and reminding me that he lived nearby if I had any questions. I told him everything was good and thanked him again for the tips. But something about it felt a little much. It wasn't like anything was wrong, but his level of interest seemed unusual for an Airbnb host. The next morning I woke up to another message from Greg. This time he asked if I'd had a good night's sleep and if I had any plans for the day. It was early and I hadn't even had breakfast yet, so I didn't respond right away. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just trying to be a good host. But it was starting to feel a little intrusive. As the day went on, I received another message asking if I had checked out one of the restaurants he had recommended. I didn't want to be rude, so I responded that I had been busy exploring the city and hadn't had the chance yet. His reply came quickly, saying he was glad I was having a good time and that he'd love to hear about my day when I got back. I remember feeling a little uncomfortable after that. Why was he so eager to know what I was up to? I didn't know if he was just overly friendly or if I was reading too much into it, but I decided to keep my responses short and to the point from then on. That night I was lying in bed, trying to unwind after a long day of walking around. I had my laptop with me and was watching a movie when I thought I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint shuffling sound like someone was moving around in the courtyard below my window. I paused the movie and listened for a minute, but everything was quiet again, so I shrugged it off and went back to watching. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, like someone was trying not to make too much noise. I froze for a second, my heart racing. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that it might be Greg, but I couldn't think of any reason why he would come by unannounced. I got out of bed and walked over to the door, listening to see if whoever it was would knock again. After a minute or two of silence, I peeked through the peephole, but no one was there. I stood there for a while, trying to convince myself it was just someone passing by or maybe a neighbor knocking on the wrong door. Eventually, I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. I made sure the door was locked and double-checked the windows before finally falling asleep. The next morning, I woke up to another message from Greg. This time, it was weirder. He said something about hoping I had enjoyed my night and that the neighborhood could be a little noisy sometimes. I felt a chill reading that. How would he know that? The knock on the door the night before had been so quiet I wasn't even sure it had happened. Was he outside the apartment, watching? I decided not to respond right away. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but I couldn't shake this gnawing feeling that something was off. I started noticing little things, like how Greg always seemed to message me right after I got back to the apartment or after I had gone out. It was like he knew my schedule without me ever telling him. That evening, I made a point to stay out later than usual. I didn't want to be back at the apartment alone, but eventually I had to go back. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard that shuffling noise again outside. This time, it was louder, like someone was walking around just outside the window. My stomach dropped. I wanted to look, but I was too scared to open the blinds. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a stray animal or someone passing by. But then, around midnight, I heard a soft creak from the hallway outside my door, like the floorboards were shifting under someone's weight. My heart was pounding. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. A few seconds later, there was another knock. Louder this time, but still hesitant, like whoever was knocking didn't want to be heard. I didn't move. I just sat there, my mind racing. It was Greg, I knew it. I hadn't told anyone else where I was staying, and there was no reason for anyone to be knocking on my door that late at night. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal inside the apartment. I hadn't bothered connecting to the Wi-Fi because it barely worked, so I had no way of calling anyone for help. I sat there for what felt like forever, not moving, not making a sound. Eventually, the knocking stopped, and I heard the creaking footsteps retreating down the hall. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother telling Greg I was leaving early. I just got in my car and drove to a hotel closer to downtown, where I could be around more people and have a working phone signal. When I finally connected to the internet, I saw that Greg had sent me more messages, asking where I was, if I was okay, and why I wasn't responding. I blocked his number without reading the rest. I never reported him to Airbnb or left a review. I didn't want to deal with it, and I didn't want to relive the whole experience. Maybe I should have said something, but I was just too freaked out. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door that night. About 2 years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to take a weekend trip up to the Catskills in New York. We both needed a break from the city, and the idea of spending a few days in a quiet old farmhouse sounded perfect. It was early fall. The weather was cool but not too cold, and we were both excited to disconnect and get away from the constant noise of New York. We found this rental on Airbnb, an older farmhouse that had been partially renovated. It looked really charming in the photos. Classic wooden beams, a stone fireplace, a huge backyard with views of the surrounding hills. The reviews were mostly positive, although a few people mentioned that the house was still undergoing some repairs. The host had noted that too, but said it wouldn't affect our stay. We didn't think much of it. We figured the house might be a little rustic, but that was part of the charm. The drive up was beautiful. The farther we got from the city, the more relaxed we felt. The roads wound through hills and dense woods, and by the time we arrived at the farmhouse, it was just starting to get dark. The house was exactly what we had expected. Old but picturesque, with a big wraparound porch and a sloping roof that looked like it had been around for a century. There was a small gravel driveway, and we were surrounded by trees. No neighbors in sight, just quiet and nature. When we arrived, the host had left a key in a lockbox by the door, so we let ourselves in. The inside of the house had that old farmhouse smell. Wood, dust, and something faintly musty, like the place hadn't been lived in for a while. The main room was cozy, with a big stone fireplace and a couple of armchairs that looked like they had been there for decades. There were exposed beams on the ceiling, and you could tell that parts of the house had been updated, but it still had that old, creaky feel. One thing we noticed right away was the noise. The house creaked. A lot. At first, it didn't bother us. We figured it was just the house settling or maybe the wind outside. But even when we were sitting quietly, there would be these loud groans and cracks, like the house was shifting on its foundation. It was weird, but we brushed it off. It was an old house after all. That first night, we cooked dinner in the small kitchen. The stove was ancient. One of those old gas ranges that looked like it belonged in a museum, but it worked fine. After dinner, we decided to light a fire in the fireplace and settled in for the evening with a couple of glasses of wine. It was peaceful. The fire crackled, and for a while we just sat there listening to it, enjoying the quiet. But then the creaking started again, louder this time. It wasn't just the occasional groan of the house settling. It was this continuous creaking, like something heavy was shifting above us. I remember looking up at the ceiling and noticing how low it seemed, like the beams were sagging. My boyfriend joked that the house was old and probably falling apart, but I could tell he was a little uneasy too. The weirdest part was that every time we heard the creaking, it seemed to be coming from different parts of the house. Sometimes from the ceiling above us, other times from down the hall, like something was moving around. We didn't think too much of it at first, but it made the house feel unstable. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, the wind picked up outside and the creaking got worse. The windows rattled a little, and the whole house seemed to groan with every gust of wind. We were staying in one of the bedrooms upstairs, and as we lay there trying to fall asleep, the noise just kept getting louder. At one point, I heard this deep, low rumble, like thunder, but it didn't sound like it was coming from outside. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud crashing sound. It was so sudden and so loud that I sat straight up in bed, my heart racing. My boyfriend was already awake, staring at the ceiling. We both listened for a minute, trying to figure out what had just happened. It sounded like something had collapsed in another part of the house. We got up and grabbed our phones to use as flashlights, and as we stepped into the hallway, I could smell this faint, earthy smell like dirt or wet wood. The hallway was dark, and the house was completely silent except for the occasional creak. We walked downstairs, shining our lights around, trying to figure out what had made that noise. That's when we noticed it. part of the ceiling in the living room had collapsed. A huge section of the plaster had fallen, scattering debris all over the floor. There was dust everywhere, and the wooden beams above were exposed. It looked like the roof had given way in that spot, and now the ceiling was sagging in other places too. My stomach dropped. We stood there for a minute, not knowing what to do. The house didn't feel safe anymore. It was like the whole thing was coming apart at the seams. My boyfriend suggested we check the other rooms to see if there was more damage. So we cautiously walked around the house looking for cracks or signs that something else was about to collapse. As we walked down the hall toward the kitchen, we heard another loud groan from above, followed by a loud bang. It sounded like something had fallen in one of the upstairs rooms. We froze. There was no one else in the house, and we hadn't touched anything that could have caused that. We made our way back upstairs, and when we reached the landing, we saw it. The ceiling in the upstairs hallway had started to bow. It wasn't cracked yet, but you could see the wooden beams straining under the weight. My boyfriend said we needed to get out of there before something else gave way. We quickly grabbed our bags and headed downstairs. As we were about to leave, we heard another loud creak, this time coming from the back of the house. We stopped and looked back toward the kitchen. The door leading to the backyard was wide open. I know we had closed it when we came in. My boyfriend tried to convince me that the wind had probably blown it open, but I could tell he didn't believe it himself. The wind wasn't that strong, and the door had been latched. We didn't stick around to investigate. We grabbed our stuff and got out of the house as fast as we could. We sat in the car for a while, just trying to calm down. My boyfriend called the host to let him know what had happened, but it went straight to voicemail. We decided to drive into town and find a hotel for the night. We weren't going to spend another minute in that house. The next day, we went back to the house in the daylight to grab the rest of our things. The place looked even worse in the daylight. The section of the ceiling that had collapsed was bigger than we had thought, and there were cracks running through the walls in several places. It was clear that the house was in serious disrepair, way worse than the host had let on. When we got to the back door, we noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were muddy footprints leading from the backyard, through the kitchen, and into the hallway. They weren't ours. We got out of there as fast as we could. My boyfriend sent another message to the host, letting him know about the damage and the footprints, but we never heard back. We left a negative review on Airbnb, but the listing was taken down shortly after. I don't know what was going on in that house, but I'm just glad we got out when we did. Last year, I decided to book a solo weekend trip to Asheville, North Carolina. I'd been working from home for months, and the isolation of living alone in a big city was starting to get to me. I needed a change of scenery, and Asheville seemed like the perfect spot. It was known for its artsy vibe, amazing food, and beautiful nature. Plus, I'd always heard great things about the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I wanted to do some hiking while I was there. I found a small studio apartment on Airbnb that was located in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It looked perfect. Small but cozy, with a little kitchenette and a private entrance. The reviews were positive, mostly saying it was a peaceful, safe spot to relax after exploring the city. The host mentioned in the listing that it was attached to a larger house but had its own private space, which seemed ideal for me. I didn't want to be completely cut off from people, but I also liked the idea of having my own little nook to unwind in after long days of exploring. When I arrived, it was late in the afternoon. The neighborhood was pretty quiet, and the house was tucked away at the end of a long, narrow driveway. It was a bit more secluded than I'd expected, but I wasn't too concerned. The house itself was a cute older home with big trees lining the property, and the studio apartment had its own entrance around the side, as described in the listing. The host wasn't there to greet me, but she had left a note with the key and some instructions about the space. She also mentioned that her neighbor, a man named Frank, lived next door, and that he was friendly but liked to keep to himself. I didn't think much of it at the time. I wasn't planning on interacting with anyone anyway. I just wanted to relax, do some hiking, and spend a little time in Asheville's downtown. The first day went smoothly. I spent most of it hiking on one of the trails near the Blue Ridge Parkway, soaking in the views and enjoying the fresh mountain air. When I got back to the apartment, I was exhausted but happy. I made myself a simple dinner, watched a movie on my laptop, and fell asleep pretty quickly. The next morning, as I was making coffee, I heard a knock on the door. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't really seen anyone around the property since I arrived. I opened the door, and there was a man standing there, probably in his 50s, with gray hair, a scruffy beard, and a kind of rough appearance. He introduced himself as Frank, the neighbor the host had mentioned. He seemed friendly enough at first, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me feel uncomfortable. He kept asking me questions. If I was alone, how long I was staying, and if I needed anything. I tried to be polite but brief in my answers, not wanting to engage too much. After a few minutes, he finally left, and I shut the door, feeling a little unsettled. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was just being friendly and that I was overreacting. But there was something about the way he'd stood there lingering that made me uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just this sense that he was a little too interested in me being there alone. Later that day, I decided to head into downtown Asheville to check out some of the shops and restaurants. The downtown area was vibrant, with lots of people walking around, street musicians playing, and small local businesses everywhere. I felt much better being around people, and for a few hours I forgot about the weird interaction with Frank. When I got back to the apartment that evening, though, things took a turn. As I was unlocking the door, I noticed something strange. The lock felt a little loose, like it had been messed with. I thought maybe I had just been paranoid after the strange encounter that morning, but when I stepped inside, I realized something was off. The door to the kitchenette was slightly ajar, and I distinctly remembered closing it before I left. I walked around the apartment, checking to see if anything had been moved or taken, but everything seemed to be in place. Still, the feeling that someone had been inside lingered. I checked the windows. They were all closed and locked, and I made sure the door was secure before trying to calm myself down. I told myself I was just being paranoid. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard footsteps outside. The apartment was located at the back of the house, so the sound of someone walking around back there stood out. I froze, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing right outside the window. My heart started pounding in my chest. I waited for what felt like an eternity, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and peered through the blinds. In the dim light from the porch, I saw a figure standing just outside the window, facing away from me. It was Frank. He was just standing there, motionless, staring at the back of the house. I quickly let go of the blinds and stepped back, trying to calm my breathing. What was he doing? Why was he standing out there in the middle of the night? I didn't know what to do. My phone barely had a signal in the apartment, and I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if I should be genuinely worried. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again. This time they moved away from the window, and I heard him walk around the side of the house. I stayed up for hours after that, listening for any other noises. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. When I woke up, I checked outside. There were footprints in the dirt near the window where Frank had been standing the night before. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just out for a walk, or maybe he had heard something and was checking on the property. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That day, I stayed out as long as I could, exploring the city and trying to avoid going back to the apartment. But eventually, I had to return. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Frank sitting on his porch, staring at my car. I tried to ignore him, quickly unlocking the door and going inside. That night, the footsteps started again. This time they were louder and they didn't stop. It sounded like someone was walking back and forth outside the apartment, pacing just outside the door. I sat in bed, clutching my phone, wondering if I should call the host or try to leave. But I didn't know where I would go, and I didn't want to make things worse by confronting Frank. Then, I heard the doorknob rattle. My heart stopped. Someone was trying to open the door. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and stood frozen in the middle of the room, listening. The rattling continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Whoever it was had given up, at least for the moment. I barely slept that night. Every little noise had me on edge, and I kept expecting the door to open at any second. In the morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and threw them in the car. As I was loading up, I glanced over at Frank's house. He was standing in his yard watching me. I didn't say a word. I got in the car and drove off, my heart racing the whole time. I didn't stop until I was miles away from Asheville, in a crowded rest stop where I finally felt safe enough to pull over and take a breath. I never reported what happened to Airbnb. I didn't leave a review. I didn't want to think about it, or deal with the hassle of explaining everything. But that weekend shook me. Roughly a year ago, I was sent on a week-long business trip to Portland, Oregon. I'd never been to the Pacific Northwest before, and I was kind of excited to check it out between meetings. My company booked me a quiet Airbnb in a residential area, close enough to downtown but far enough to avoid the touristy spots. The listing was for a small house with a yard, described as perfect for business travelers. The host, who I'll call Mark, had a few reviews. Nothing remarkable, but enough to seem legitimate. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The house was in a typical suburban neighborhood, with neat little homes lined up on both sides of a quiet street. It was a one-story house with a small front yard and a gravel driveway. It looked pretty much like the pictures, unassuming, clean, and simple. I let myself in with the code Mark had sent me and started unpacking. The inside was basic but comfortable. Nothing fancy. Just a place to crash after long workdays. Mark had left a note on the kitchen counter welcoming me and listing a few house rules. He mentioned that the Wi-Fi could be spotty sometimes, but that there was a cafe down the street if I needed better access. The first night was uneventful. I got settled in, reviewed some work stuff for the next day, and then went to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep before my meetings. The next day, everything was normal. I spent most of the day at the office downtown, grabbed dinner with a couple of colleagues, and then headed back to the house. The neighborhood was quiet, and it felt nice to come back to a space that felt more like a home than a hotel. I had a couple of emails to finish up, but the Wi-Fi was acting up, so I decided to call it a night. The second night was when things started to feel off. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone and waiting for an email to load when there was a knock on the front door. It was already late, probably around 9:30, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the door, but when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. I figured maybe it was a prank or someone knocking on the wrong door, so I didn't think much of it and went back to the couch. A few minutes later, there was another knock. Same thing. No one was there. This time I walked outside, looking around to see if there was anyone in the yard or on the street. But everything was still. The only light was from a nearby street lamp casting shadows across the road. I went back inside feeling a little uneasy, but telling myself it was probably just a kid messing around. The next day, I mentioned the knocks to a colleague at work, who shrugged it off, saying that Portland was a pretty safe place and it was probably just someone messing with me. That reassured me for a while, and I tried to focus on work and forget about it. That night, I was back at the house after another long day. I had just finished eating dinner when I heard voices outside, low murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. I peeked out the front window, but again, I didn't see anyone. It was weird, but I told myself it was probably neighbors or someone passing by. A few hours later, just as I was getting ready for bed, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was louder and more persistent. I checked the peephole again. No one. But now I was freaked out. I stood there for a minute trying to decide what to do, when suddenly I heard footsteps behind the house near the back door. I grabbed my phone and called the host, Mark, hoping he could explain what was going on or at least reassure me that everything was fine. He didn't answer, so I left a message telling him about the knocks and the strange noises. I tried to relax, but I barely slept that night, every little sound keeping me on edge. The next day, Mark finally called me back. He apologized for not getting back to me sooner and said he'd look into it. He brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal, saying that sometimes local kids like to mess around with people staying in rentals. I wasn't entirely convinced, but I tried to go along with it. Maybe I was overreacting. That evening, I got back to the house after another full day of meetings. I was trying to shake off the stress of work and relax when there was a knock at the door again, same as before. But this time, when I checked the peephole, there were two people standing outside. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but they were both dressed casually, looking tense, almost like they were waiting for something. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood there, watching as they whispered to each other and knocked again. After what felt like forever, they finally left, walking down the street and disappearing into the night. I called Mark again, but he didn't pick up. I sent him a text, telling him that people had been at the door and asking if he knew anything about it. Still no response. At this point, I was starting to feel like something was really wrong. I locked all the doors, made sure the windows were secure, and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke up to several missed calls and texts from Mark, all sent late in the night. He apologized again, saying he had just seen my messages and that the people at the door were probably looking for him. He mentioned that he'd had some issues with local business partners and that they sometimes showed up unannounced. That set off alarm bells. What kind of issues? Why were they coming to the house I was staying in? I texted him back, asking for more details, but he didn't respond right away. The rest of the day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept going back to those people at the door, the noises, and the feeling that I was somehow caught in the middle of something I didn't understand. When I got back to the house that evening, there were more knocks, louder, more insistent. I didn't even bother checking the door this time. I just stayed in the back room, hoping they'd leave. After a while, they stopped, but I knew something wasn't right. Later that night, around 11 p.m., I heard a car pull up outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw a group of people standing around the car, talking in hushed voices. They were looking at the house, pointing at it, and it didn't take long for them to start walking toward the front door. I froze. There was no way I was going to answer the door. I had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but it was clear they were looking for something or someone. My mind went back to Mark's vague comments about issues with business partners. What kind of business was he involved in? Why was his house a target? The knocking started again, louder than ever. I grabbed my phone and called Mark, but of course he didn't answer. I tried calling the police, but by the time I got through, the knocking had stopped and the people were gone. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to drive by, but no one ever showed up while I was there. The rest of the night was a blur. I barely slept, and every sound made me jump. By the time the sun came up, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying there another night. I packed up my stuff and got out of there, heading straight to a hotel downtown where I at least felt a little safer. It wasn't until later that day, when I finally got a hold of Mark, that things really started to make sense. Or at least I started to piece things together. He admitted, after a lot of back and forth, that he had been using the house for more than just Airbnb rentals. He was involved in some kind of shady business. He didn't give me all the details, but it sounded like he owed money to some dangerous people. And now, because I was staying there, they thought I was somehow connected to him. I was furious, but more than that, I was scared. I had been caught up in something I had no part in, and I didn't know if those people would come back, looking for him or for me. I left Portland the next day, cutting my trip short. I never heard from Mark again, and his Airbnb listing disappeared not long after. About a year ago, I decided to book a week-long stay at an Airbnb in a small town just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I was looking for a quiet place to focus on writing and get away from my everyday life. The town was pretty remote, but it had a certain charm. I found this cute little house on Airbnb that seemed perfect for what I wanted. Small, cozy, and completely off the beaten path. It was surrounded by trees with a view of the mountains in the distance. The host, who I'll call Sarah, had good reviews, and the listing seemed legit. The house had strong Wi-Fi, a small kitchen, and a private workspace, all things I was looking for. I figured it would be a peaceful place to get some writing done and maybe even do a little hiking on the nearby trails. The price was right, and the few reviews mentioned that Sarah was helpful but not overbearing. It seemed perfect for a low-key, productive retreat. I arrived late in the afternoon on a Sunday. The town was even smaller than I had expected. Just a few shops, a diner, and a gas station. There wasn't much around the Airbnb either, just the house, trees, and winding roads. It felt a little more isolated than I had anticipated, but I wasn't too worried about it. I was looking forward to the solitude. When I got to the house, Sarah was there to greet me. She was polite, but seemed a little distracted. She walked me through the house, showed me how to use the thermostat, and gave me a rundown of how the Wi-Fi worked. She mentioned the area had spotty cell service, but said the internet connection was reliable. There was something a little off about her. She seemed nervous, like she was rushing through the whole introduction, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just busy. The house itself was fine, small but clean, with basic furniture and a cozy vibe. There was a big window in the living room that looked out over the woods, and the bedroom had a comfortable-looking bed. It was simple, exactly what I wanted. After Sarah left, I unpacked and settled in for the evening. I spent a couple of hours catching up on some emails and reading, and then I went to bed early. The next morning, I woke up to find that my credit card wasn't working. I had planned to stop by the local store for groceries, but when I tried to pay, the card was declined. At first, I thought it was just a fluke, maybe a temporary issue with my bank. But when I checked my account, I saw several charges I didn't recognize. They were all small, weird transactions, online purchases from places I had never heard of. I called my bank, and they told me they'd put a hold on the card due to suspicious activity. It seemed strange, but I figured it was just one of those things that happen from time to time. I had a backup card, so I wasn't too worried. I figured I'd deal with it later and went on with my day. I spent most of the day writing, occasionally stepping outside to take in the fresh air. The house was so quiet that it was almost unnerving. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind through the trees. Later that afternoon, I noticed that my phone signal had dropped completely. I hadn't had great service since I arrived, but now it was dead. The Wi-Fi was still working, though, so I didn't think much of it. I figured the lack of cell service was part of being in a remote area. That night, I stayed in, cooked a simple dinner, and watched some shows online. The next day, things got weirder. I woke up to find that my phone wasn't working at all. It wouldn't turn on, and I couldn't get it to charge. I had been using it the night before with no issues, so this felt really strange. It was completely dead, like the battery had just drained overnight. I tried different chargers, different outlets. Nothing worked. I couldn't even get it to show the charging symbol on the screen. Now I was starting to feel uneasy. I decided to reach out to Sarah, but when I opened my laptop to send her a message, I realized I was locked out of my email account. My password wasn't working, and when I tried to reset it, I wasn't getting the recovery emails. I checked a few other accounts, my social media, my cloud storage, and all of them were locked. It was like someone had gone through and systematically taken control of my entire digital life. Panic started to set in. I couldn't figure out how this had happened. I had been careful, hadn't clicked on any weird links or used public Wi-Fi. It didn't make sense. I tried to stay calm, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like someone had gotten access to my personal information and was using it to take over my accounts. That's when I remembered something Sarah had said when I first arrived, something about how she used to work in tech. It was just a passing comment, but now it seemed significant. Could she have done something to my devices? Could she have installed something on the Wi-Fi, some kind of keylogger or spyware? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I tried to reach out to my bank again, but with my phone dead and no access to my email, I was stuck. I was completely cut off from the outside world. The only connection I had was through the Airbnb messaging system, which was still working, barely. I messaged Sarah, asking her if there was a problem with the Wi-Fi or the phone signal in the area. She replied quickly, saying that the signal could be unreliable and that it wasn't unusual for phones to act up in such a remote location. She assured me that the Wi-Fi was fine, but something about her response felt off. It was too dismissive, too quick, like she didn't want me to dig any deeper. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I started getting notifications on my laptop. Messages from unknown accounts. They were all the same. Demands for money. Someone had hacked into my accounts and was now blackmailing me. They had access to my email, my social media, and worst of all, my cloud storage, where I kept personal documents and photos. They threatened to release everything unless I sent them money. I felt sick. My entire digital life was in someone else's hands, and I had no way to stop them. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no phone, no service, and no way to get help. I tried to think of what I could do, but my options were limited. I had no way to reach anyone, no way to contact the authorities. I spent the rest of the night trying to figure out how they had gotten into my accounts. It all seemed to point back to the Airbnb. The Wi-Fi had been working fine when I arrived, but now I was starting to wonder if it had been compromised from the start. Maybe Sarah had installed something on the network to monitor my activity. Maybe she was behind all of this. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't bother telling Sarah I was leaving early. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. I drove to a nearby town and found a coffee shop with free Wi-Fi. From there, I was able to contact my bank and lock down my accounts. I filed a report with the police, but I knew there was little they could do. Whoever had hacked into my life was probably long gone by now. I never went back to that Airbnb. I left a vague, negative review, warning others about the unreliable Wi-Fi and the strange behavior of the host. But I never mentioned the hacking or the blackmail. I didn't want to relive the whole thing, and I wasn't sure anyone would believe me anyway. Looking back, I'm still not sure how it all happened. Maybe Sarah was involved, maybe not. But the experience left me shaken. I've been more careful with my personal information since then. But the thought of how easily someone could take control of my life still haunts me. It's terrifying how vulnerable we are, especially in a world where so much of our lives are online. Last year, my boyfriend and I decided to take a long weekend trip to the Oregon coast. We had been going through a rough patch with work stress and just needed to get away, somewhere quiet where we could relax and focus on each other. After some searching, we found what looked like the perfect Airbnb. A small, secluded beach house just outside of Cannon Beach, tucked away in the trees, overlooking the Pacific. It seemed peaceful and private, exactly what we needed. The house itself looked great in the listing, modern but cozy, with big windows facing the ocean and a wraparound deck where we could watch the sunset. The host, who I'll call Jessica, had good reviews and seemed friendly enough in the few messages we exchanged before the trip. She mentioned that she lived nearby and could help if we needed anything, but assured us we'd have the place to ourselves. It all seemed ideal. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive along the coast was beautiful, and by the time we pulled up to the house, the stress of the last few months felt like it was finally lifting. The house was just as described, modern but with a homey feel, surrounded by trees with the sound of waves crashing in the distance. The only other house in sight was about a quarter of a mile down the road, and it looked empty. We let ourselves in with the key from the lockbox and unpacked. The house was small but comfortable, with a little living room, a fireplace, and a fully stocked kitchen. We spent the first evening just hanging out, cooking dinner, and sitting on the deck with a bottle of wine. It felt like we were completely alone in the world, and it was perfect. The first night passed without incident. We woke up the next morning and decided to head into Cannon Beach to explore. It's a charming little town with art galleries, shops, and great restaurants. We spent most of the day there, walking along the beach and checking out the tide pools. It was exactly the kind of relaxing day we needed. By the time we got back to the house that evening, we were tired but happy, ready to settle in for another quiet night. That's when things started to get strange. It was around sunset when we first heard it. This loud banging on the front door. My boyfriend and I looked at each other, confused. We weren't expecting anyone, and we hadn't seen or heard anyone else around since we arrived. The house was pretty remote, and the road leading up to it wasn't exactly the kind of place people just wandered down by accident. My boyfriend went to the door, and when he opened it, there was a man standing there. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, tall and unkempt, with a wild look in his eyes. He immediately started yelling, demanding to know where Jessica was. My boyfriend tried to explain that we were just renting the house, that we didn't know Jessica personally, but the man didn't seem to care. He kept shouting her name, saying he knew she was inside and that she needed to come out and talk to him. At this point, I was freaked out. My boyfriend tried to calm the guy down, telling him again that Jessica wasn't there and that we didn't know where she was. The man eventually backed off, but not before he warned us to tell Jessica that he'd come by. He walked away down the road, disappearing into the trees. We were both shaken, but tried to brush it off. My boyfriend said the guy was probably just a local with some personal beef with the host. It didn't feel great, but we figured it was a one-off situation. We locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to relax. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. What were the chances he'd come back? The rest of the evening was tense. We couldn't stop thinking about that guy and the way he had just shown up out of nowhere, yelling for Jessica like he was ready to break down the door. I kept asking myself if Jessica had warned us about anything in her messages, but she hadn't. She never mentioned anyone, especially not someone who seemed dangerous. Around midnight, we were in bed trying to sleep when the banging started again. This time it was even louder, like someone was hitting the door with their fists over and over. My heart raced as my boyfriend jumped out of bed and went to the front door. He didn't open it this time, just shouted through the door, asking who it was. There was no answer at first, just more banging. Finally, the same man's voice came through, yelling that he knew Jessica was hiding in the house and that he wasn't going to leave until he saw her. He was slurring his words now, clearly drunk, and getting angrier with every second. At that point, I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police. But of course, the cell service out there was terrible. The call wouldn't go through and we had no landline in the house. My boyfriend was trying to reason with the guy through the door, telling him again that we didn't know Jessica and that he needed to leave. But the man wasn't listening. He kept shouting, banging on the door and circling the house, looking for another way in. I've never felt so helpless in my life. We were trapped in this house, in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help. The man outside was getting more and more aggressive, slamming on the windows, shouting that he was going to break in if we didn't let him in. At some point, my boyfriend grabbed a kitchen knife, just in case, and we huddled in the bedroom, hoping the guy would give up and leave. But the banging continued. It felt like it went on for hours, though in reality it was probably only 30 minutes. Finally, the noise stopped. We waited, not sure if he had left or if he was just outside, waiting for us to come out. My boyfriend checked the front door through the peephole, but the guy was gone. We didn't hear him walking away, didn't hear any cars, just silence. That night, neither of us slept. We stayed up, listening for any signs that he might come back. Every little creak of the house, every gust of wind made us jump. By morning, we were exhausted and decided to pack up and leave. We didn't feel safe staying there another night, especially not after what had happened. Before we left, I messaged Jessica, telling her what had happened and asking if she knew who the man was. I expected an apology or at least an explanation, but what I got was much worse. Jessica replied quickly, telling me that the man was her ex-boyfriend. She said they had broken up a few months ago, and he had been harassing her ever since. She said she thought he had moved away and didn't expect him to come back, but apparently he had found out where she was staying and had assumed she was hiding out in the house. That's when I realized that Jessica had probably been using the house to stay under the radar from this guy, and we had just walked right into the middle of it. She apologized for the situation and offered to refund us for the rest of the stay, but by that point, we were already in the car, driving back to Portland. We didn't look back. We just wanted to get as far away from that house and that guy as possible. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.